probably just get into it. I mean, so I think would be good to chat about today, and I'd like to pick your brains a bit on sort of how you started, from my understanding, which is just sort of with single properties, you know, buying those or sort of refurbing them all the way through to now being Birmingham's largest homegrown developer, and sort of what that journey has been like, and then what sort of pearls of wisdom people listening that are maybe just starting out or on their third or fourth property can take out of that and apply to their own lessons. So, you know, why don't we go all the way back to the start, and if you could give us a bit of info on how you got into property. Was it something you always wanted to do, or did you fall into it? What's the story?
I think I started out looking more goal focused, and I was looking for a way to achieve that goal. So I was looking at the original objective when I was kind of 18, 19 was, you know, how do you build £1 million worth of value as a net worth? So I'd read books, and you know, and then it comes back to, okay, well, all these books are giving you, you know, the mindset and you know how you need to execute and how you need to do different things, you know, to be a certain way. And a lot of that self-help stuff I read, you know, from sort of, you know, say early years of sort of 17, 18 when I got into it. And I'm still reading them today. I think it was just as good as those books are, they can obviously never give you, you know, the route to take. So all they can give you is the kind of the fundamentals of how you as an individual might do well to make your way through life, you know, having a certain attitude and doing certain things, and obviously having a discipline. But it was about finding the method of how you were actually going to get from sort of A to B. As a young guy, I suppose it's kind of, you know, back then at least £1 million was a lot of money, still is. But, you know, you kind of, you know, but back then it was kind of, you know, rather than nowadays, you know, people talking in billionaires, then, you know, that didn't really exist then. So, you know, to become a millionaire was kind of, you know, seen as a big marker of success. So on a financial level, at least. So I think for me, it was kind of just trying to work out how you could get from not a lot to £1 million. And £1 million was kind of, you know, whether it be liquid or whether it just be in assets. And initially for me, it was, if I can acquire £1 million worth of property through paying a small deposit down and then buying properties that then you rent out, just seemed like a no-brainer, really. You know, I looked at lots of other ways that you could potentially do it, but nothing really kind of had the same metrics as property does, did and still does. So I think to be able to create wealth from, you know, a small deposit was, you know, so I was working at the time, got a small food business, sandwiches, which I used to sort of, you know, I used to run sandwich vans. And then, so I was earning good money from that business, and taking into account from a kind of an opportunity perspective, you know, if we go back to, you know, this is now, I'm 53 this year, so, you know, you can do the maths, but, you know, kind of like, you know, 30 odd years ago. And obviously property prices were a lot lower then. So, you know, being able to buy a small buy-to-let in a relatively modest suburban town of Birmingham was kind of £35,000. So,
wow.
So to be able to amass kind of, you know, 20%, you know, working in another business, living very frugally, and you know, really not spending a lot of money, and it was all going into deposits. And then so I managed to start amassing properties on a yearly basis. I would collect X amount of properties. That was really sort of the start of it for me. So I was doing a lot of the hands-on work myself. Fortunately, the sandwich business meant that I would be up very early, but then I would also finish my day quite early. So by 11 o'clock, it was an early start, but you'd make your sandwiches, you'd go out in your vans, and we'd all sell them, and then we'd come back, and you know, and then we'd clean everything down for the day, and then by midday you'd got the afternoon. So then I was able to go and then start refurbishing houses, you know, dealing with tenants, doing the lettings myself. So I pretty much kept, you know, I learned a lot about the real basics about property, you know, both from a kind of physical perspective, you know, doing the work on them myself, as well as kind of, you know, the tenancies and managing tenants and whatnot at quite an early age. So that was the start, really, as far as how I got started and why property.
So I guess it's, you know, because I was sort of expecting a different answer being a developer now, but I guess you got into it for the same reasons we all get into it and many other people get into it, which is as a way to amass and create wealth, right, for the future. Because it is, you talk about those books, a lot of the books reference real estate if it's an American book, or property if it's British or European, as ways to do that, right? So I actually ordered one of the books you were talking about the other day. I think it was 12 a year in 12 weeks.
12 week. Yeah. So it works on the premise that if you think about how we work mentally, you look at everything in 12 months. So you write your goals and you say, okay, well, I want to get into this sort of physical shape within the next 12 months, or I want to earn X amount of money, or I want to move the business from this point to that point in 12 months. And actually 12 months in some ways is not a lot of time, particularly in the development world. Things take a long time. So 12 months is not a particularly big window of time. But when it comes to your personal goals, you can get a lot done in 12 months, but you can get more done if you break it down into 4 quarters and you have that same impetus. So you start off the year in January, fired up, ready for the year. You write your goals down, you're all excited, and then, as a lot of people do, head off to the gym, and then they maybe sort of 6 weeks in, things have changed. So it has that ability to keep resetting you 4 times a year, ultimately, rather than just once a year. And then it also gives you that impetus where if you're heading toward the end of your 12-week year, you've got a big push on to achieve, what you would need to achieve in effect. So you're really kind of just looking at, the idea is that you've got that same impetus that you have, but 4 times a year rather than just once a year.
Keeps you a bit more honest, I guess, because I'm the same. I write all of mine down and I stick them down in my book, and every morning I have a little look through them, and I've always tried to do a sort of a refresh mid-year, which is end of June. You sort of go back through what you wrote down in December or January and see, okay, am I on track? Do I need to tweak it?
Yep.
But I guess if you add in 3 more of those review sessions, it would be even better. Sorry to interrupt, but if you're enjoying this piece of content and would like to find out more about buying property and our key 10 steps to doing so, then pop your details in the link below somewhere and grab a copy of our book, 10 Steps to 10K, the Expat Property Playbook. Enjoy. Strategy then. So what was you talked a bit about refurbing there. So back in the early days when you were starting, did you have, because that's another thing, you will know property investors love to bang on about strategy. What's the best strategy? What strategy should I use? What property should I buy? In reality, the best strategy is just get as many as possible, as quickly as possible. But people are always looking for that sort of perfect silver bullet, I guess. So did you have a set strategy, or was it, okay, just put as little down as possible, get as much as I can, add as much value as I can? What were you trying to do?
I think at the time it was volume. So it was just kind of, how many houses can I buy in the shortest possible time, or more like, rather than the shortest possible time, sort of how quickly, when I bought the last house, can I buy the next house? So it was just about sort of amassing as many as possible at the time. I wasn't particularly, I think there's probably things I did naively, but I think as well, I had obviously age on my side. So I think strategy, when people talk about strategy, and as a side note, my strategy at my age is going to be different to your strategy at your age. Someone that might be listening to this who's, a 30-year-old, should have a different strategy to someone in their 50s or 60s. I think there's a strategy for everyone, but they should be different strategies, because, you can't flip properties the way you used to be able to. I don't see
from a cost perspective now with stamp duty and
I struggle to see how anyone can really buy and sell and trade a property in a short period, just down to exactly that, the volume of costs. And the exit costs. So both coming in and going out, those costs are basically just going to eat up any real sort of margin. So it's always been a long-term play for me. I think it's always been a buy and hold, and then for me it's always been a buy and a hold on a repayment, because ultimately I want to be able to pay that asset off, and I want to just be able to take the income at some point in the future, which is still the optimum strategy. So you're either buying for younger people, should be buying on a repayment basis, or at least have an idea of how they're going to pay that off if it's not on a direct repayment basis. Buying property, renting it out, and then looking at the long-term play. It should be a pension provision ultimately.
I think that's right. You should have a strategy, but it shouldn't be a sort of preset strategy, which is, I'm going to do BRRR, or I'm only going to do holiday lets, or whatever, or rent to rent, whatever it might be. It should be a strategy that you've created based on exactly what you were talking about, right? Your goals. If you are, 55 and you want to retire at 60, then your strategy is going to be very, very different. You're going to need to put a lot more down, or whatever it might be, versus a 25-year-old or 30-year-old where you can just buy it and let time do its thing.
Sure.
The stuff you were buying back in the early days, is that still part of the portfolio?
It is, yeah, it is. I've sold very little of it, actually. I'm a bit of a hoarder, but I haven't actually sold any of it. So yeah, I think and I mean that was really. So if you kind of fast forward, sort of maybe 10, 15 years, those properties that I bought, I was fortunate to acquire the houses I did, and then that gave me the kind of it was the backbone of being able to sort of migrate from buy to let into then doing development.
And then what did that look like then? Did you started very small and just sort of did one or two, got a track record, or what was the migration?
Started relatively small. I was able to securitize those properties that I had that over those 10, 15 years, that obviously, there was a lot of equity there. So I was able to secure those to then get some debt to then go on and do my first development, which was a small development in Birmingham. I mean, I look back now and it's actually a reasonable size development for a first attempt. It was 30.
How many units?
It was 39 units, so it wasn't.
Yeah, it's quite big.
Yeah, and it was in the city, so it wasn't the easiest thing to do. But I did it very differently to how I would do it now. I did the right thing as far as I probably paid sort of top tier contractors. Did it very de-risked it from the point of view of just because obviously I'm not a builder, so for me to buy the site with planning again, so I'd have paid a lot of money for the site with planning to give it to a tier one contractor, i.e. a sort of a contractor with a very strong balance sheet that sort of to de-risk it, and then they handed it back to me with the keys. So on that basis, it's very unlike development today, but back then that's the sort of thing you could do and still make a margin, i.e. kind of buy the land with a ticket, as we call it, planning consent, and give it to a contractor, and then the contractor does the job, hands you the keys back at the end, and then you've then got your building built. So development was a lot more simpler in those days for a whole multitude of reasons.
What's the difference now is that you can't just get one sort of general or master contractor builder to do it all. You've got to find all the different parts, or what's changed?
Yes, I think, we do kind of every part of the journey now. So I'll acquire sites without consent. So it's about viability and very few schemes based on the current market from a sales perspective value, and then the build cost value, and then and from an anticipated land value or an expected land value. If you put those three together, 90+% of schemes, aren't viable, and that's one of the things that governments just don't really appreciate when they talk about building out a lot more houses. It's very, very hard to find viable schemes where you can actually make a margin, a safe margin as a developer, because you never make the margin you think you're going to make. So you need to have a buffer in there, because inevitably every single job, whatever size it is, whatever shape it is, will always cost you more, will not always take you longer, but inevitably you'll always find something in a site that you didn't anticipate. So you have to have a margin in to be able to cover that, because it's always there. The development world now is so much more complex. Running planning consents, takes you a lot longer. There's a lot less resource in the planning process now. It's a lot more political, so planning consents take a lot longer. They're a lot more technical. There's a lot more things that you need to provide from a plan application perspective, from will it flood, tall buildings, all the different fire regs that have come in, in the last few years post Grenville, building control, building specification, eco parts to it, from the point of view of it being efficient as a building, and all these different regulations that come in and are layered on top of each other just make the whole process a lot more cumbersome, a lot more expensive. And understandably, I'm not saying it shouldn't be there. I'm just saying that the overall process now is a lot more technical. It's a lot more expensive. I mean, for example, above 18 metres now, even after you've got your planning consent, you have to go in for a gateway application. So it's an application which basically allows you to build it. So although you've gone through your 4 or 5 years of planning consent, you then go into the next round, which is you have to go to HSE and basically present to them the methodology of build, exactly who's going to be on site, are they competent, how are you going to build it, is it the most efficient it could be, does it hit all the regulations on the page? So you can't then have any sort of change of construction methodology when you're on site. All of this has to be agreed now before you get on site. So all of those different components that go into that application. As an example, our last application was 9 months, and I probably spent £800,000 in consultants fees.
Bloody hell. That is mental when you consider, now more than ever, we need to be building more quality homes for people, and it's getting more and more difficult. You said 18 meters. What's that in terms of floors? Would that be about five stories or?
Yeah, it's kind of it's probably a bit more. It's probably sort of 7, 8. On typical sort of schemes. But yeah, anything sort of that's now classed as a sort of a high-rise, high-risk building.
You can see how, obviously you've seen how times have changed, but I was the other day reading Donald Trump's book and The Art of the Deal, and he talks about how every single project he did in the 80s was, under budget and on time. Every single one of them, so... well, if it's true or not, who knows? He wrote the book, didn't he?
You can probably take a view on that statement, like most of his, to be honest.
Yeah, you can. Anyway, let's not get into that. That's not what this podcast is for. Maybe we'll just get into your time as an expat, but just quickly before that, we started talking about goals, and it is sort of human nature, I think, as you set a goal. Okay, I'm going to get to X amount of income from property, or I'm going to get to this age with this many assets, or whatever it may be, and then I'm going to stop, or I'm going to hang the boots up, or take it easy. Whatever, everyone's version is different, and the reality of it is that never happens, right? You always extend your goal. It always changes, gets bigger, indefinitely. I think from what I've seen in my 30 odd years on the planet. So, What are your goals now for the business, and from a property perspective? Are they ever changing and ever increasing, or are you sort of at a point where you're saying, okay, I'm happy, I just want to sort of build it out? What's your thinking at the moment?
I think it's, I've got headline goals, and then there's a lot of kind of, a lot smaller goals that fall underneath that. So one might be, we typically have around 1,000 units in pipeline. So in pipeline, I'd mean sort of under construction at any one time. That's our kind of typical, and that's a mix of houses and apartments. And obviously those are on kind of 2 to 3 year cycles. But at any one time, we've typically got, as I say, around 1,000, and that's a mix of sort of new build apartments in the city. So currently we've got 156 in Southside, 711 in Smithfield, and then on the housing side, we're currently on with 300 homes in Broadoaks, and then you get all the sort of PD stuff, which is office into conversion into residential, which kind of plugs the gap there, and is typically sitting at around sort of 200 to 300 units in a cycle of renovation. And then alongside that, so you've kind of got the big goal, which is build this current generation of sites out on time to budget. So following Donald there, if I can manage that would be great. And then you've kind of got all those sub goals that come underneath that, which are as important. We're always looking to evolve customer service. We're always we're doing a lot of work at the moment, and I think there's always work to be done on that. We take feedback seriously, so I think there's an education piece that's required in the business, which we're currently looking to do. When I say education to buyers, where of some of the complexities they might face around mortgages, completions. We had a very strong year last year on completions as a business, so it's good for the bottom line. But then on reflection, could we have done a better job, with our clients through that period? I think there's some of it. It's an imperfect process. So I think anyone that's bought a house in the UK knows that your average conveyancing solicitor, it's quite a challenge for them to do what you need them to do when you need them to do it. And for them to make that a kind of a seamless process just to buy a property, which is a pretty basic administrational task, really. So, why is it so difficult? So when you compound that up, if you imagine if you've ever bought a home yourself, and if there's any challenges around legals or challenges around arranging a mortgage and dovetailing all those things in together, when you multiply that up by hundreds, and then you're then working with hundreds of clients that are all in that position of needing their mortgage on the day for completion, alongside the solicitors doing what they need to do, I'm not sure you ever get that in sort of perfect alignment. And I say perfect alignment, one from a pure, process position, will the lender do exactly what they need to do when they need to do it and give you your mortgage offer a few days before your completion, and the solicitor does what they need to do when they need to do it, and they're ready to complete on the property, and everything's no hassle and everything's easy breezy and it all runs lovely. from a process perspective, that's one, and then two, from a kind of buyer's and expectation perspective, and that's what I think we need to do some more work on as a business, and that's a lot around education, because I'm not sure that you can create the perfect hands-off experience, start to finish. So we find that clients, they enjoy the buying process. We give a lot of updates. So I do a lot of live on-site video updates as well as the team. So we like to keep clients updated and informed exactly where their build is throughout the process. But I think through experience and where we've tried to refine the process as well as we can, I'm not sure we can refine the process anymore. So maybe it's about educating clients to what they should expect, and some of these anomalies and delays and sort of pressure points are all very normal. I think so. That's an area we can do some work on in the business as a goal that we're working on for this year, to make improvements for both the process of the client journey as well as aligning the client's expectations with the reality is something that we're working to correlate.
Yeah, I think that the education piece is so important, right? Because it seems quite straightforward to buy a property. You find the property, you get your mortgage in place, you work with a conveyancing team or a legal team. But in reality, within that, there's so many variables. The country the person's living in, have they got all their documents? Are they responsive? How much workload is the conveyancer under? Is the bill going to be on time? Has something changed? And I think, the best way to do that is with education, I think, and, maybe some sort of resources, video resources, or, an information pack. We try to do it. Here's my plug. We tried to do it with the book and just sort of, show people how it's done. But it's a simple process, but every time you buy something, it's different almost.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's why it works between Prosperity and APW, because we find that APW clients, are more educated than others. I think that because of the advice you give them, they kind of come to, when they're working with us, they've got a better understanding of the process, and they're probably a bit more realistic of the process. I mean, from a developer perspective, from you as a consultant perspective, and the client, we're all on the same track. We all just want to make this thing happen as smoothly as possible, and then when it needs to, as swiftly as possible. The client wants to complete, start getting their income. We as a developer want to deliver that product, and then we want to hand it over to the buyer. And then go into the lettings management, because all of those different components are commercially better for us and for the client. So we're all on the same track, and some of it is just kind of, I think, just trying to, build that relationship with clients and through education where, some of the unforeseen, some of the delays are maybe just a bit more expected. So that's just something that we're working on at the moment, I think. Yeah,
and I think if it was easy, everyone would do it, right? I had a client recently who had a small down valuation on a property he bought, not via yourselves, but he was like, what's this all about? And I sort of explained to him, that valuers and valuations can be quite fickle. It depends on the valuer on the day. Did he have an argument? He or she have an argument with their partner? What side of the bed did they wake up on? Was it raining? Was it sunny? Have they done previous stuff in the site? Did they like it? And it's all very subjective or objective. I always get those two mixed up, but it's very much down to opinion, right? Yeah. It's not really a reflection. The best reflection of the market value is what the market's saying, what are comparables selling at, what are Knight Frank, Savills, JLL saying about it. Those are the things you need to look at, and not what some person is saying on any given morning, I think. I
mean, just on that point, I think as well, it's what goes on behind the scenes that you don't really get to explain to a client. So your client there that may have had a down valuation, the surveyor market, the surveyor industry, should I say, they're getting different briefs all the time. So, they're being told, sort of strengths and weaknesses in the market. So that's gonna, but they're very general. So, you're finding that, that if they're getting information, there's an information flow to be able to say, based on what the Bank of England are going to be doing or general trends in the market, which again can be distorting the valuation of a property, because you could have very strong pockets of the market, pockets of cities and whatnot that are in high demand, and then other areas that aren't in such high demand. So some of that can obviously take their view on what the value of property is as of today. the key one for us is how the valuation is instructed. So what you find is that a lot of these valuations that are happening now, the market has never been better for buy-to-let products, and particularly for expats. I think if you go back 10 years, there was probably a third of the products available for expats to buy with a mortgage with a reasonable rate. So it was a lot more competitive environment, it was a lot less competitive environment. Rates were a lot higher. So now we're in this kind of environment where there's a lot more players chasing the same amount of buyers.
Yeah.
So it's become more competitive. So one of the tactics that a lot of the lenders use is, rather than do an open market valuation, they'll give you a headline rate to say, we'll lend you money at 4% on a 75% loan to value. So you put your application in, and that's great. And then when it comes to valuation, they'll actually do a valuation on what they call a forced sale, which is a 6-week sale.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because yes, they'll lend you the money at 4%. Yes, they'll do it on 75% LTV. But on that basis, the underwriter says, well, I want a forced valuation. I want a 6-week sale. So yourself, if you want to sell your car, you need to sell whatever. On a 6-week sale, on a forced sale, a fire sale basis, it's always less money. So we get a lot of valuers come out and they'll value it. And then when we interrogate them, they don't always tell us, but the ones that do will discreetly say, I'm on a forced valuation here. I can't value this anymore. I've got to value it on a 6-week sale. And that information doesn't go back to the client. But the lender's offering you a product that looks great on the headline, but they never really wanted to lend you 75%. They never really wanted to lend you at 4%. So by way of valuation, they can distort the figures. So you actually end up buying at 60% or 65% against the real value of that property. So they're de-risking their loan book, keeping the headline very marketable, but de-risking their loan book by distorting how they instruct the valuations. So this is something that's going on, which it's very difficult then to say to a client, well, your value is valued on a 6-week forced sale basis. But again, so it's education, and this is the sort of thing that if you can explain that to a client, but if they're buying a property at 200,000 and they get a valuation at 180, the first thing they say to you is, well, Callum, what this property's not worth what you've said it's worth. Well, it is. Yeah. And it's probably worth more, but the reality is, on a 6-week sale, if I've got to put my neck out to say, right, as a valuer, what's going to sell this in 6 weeks, no more, then it's always going to be lower.
I didn't know that. I didn't realise that they did that, but that's the whole point with it, isn't it? It's such as I say, it's a simple process, but there's so much going on within it, and that's where you need to sort of, educate yourself. And I've had a few properties that have been downvalued myself, and actually try and look at it from a positive perspective. I thought it was good, because it means I put more money in and my mortgage is going to be a little bit lower, and remortgaging them at a later date, I got them at over what they were originally valued at anyway. So
I think it can be good. It's just not great at the time when that buyer's buying something and thinks they've got to put in 30,000, it ends up being 35,000. So it's more about dealing with that client at the time, trying to explain the rationale behind it and what's actually happening versus their perception that they're buying something that's not worth what they're paying for it.
100%. And I think that's it. Once you understand like most things, it's easier. Let's just talk a bit about then your because you're in the UK now, but you haven't always been in the UK. You were an expat for a while, and that's sort of the Expat Property Portfolio is the name of the podcast.
Okay.
That's what we're talking about. So where were you as an expat? How did you find it? What's the story there?
It was a fantastic era for us as a couple and then a family. We look back on it fondly. I think we still look back now and talk about. I think you just become this kind of a lot closer as a family, or sort of you become almost like a little cell of your family, kind of in
a little unit.
A little unit that you don't sort of ultimately have when you're in the UK, because it's, I don't know. But reflect on being an expat, and obviously the whole journey of being an expat on a personal level, understanding different cultures, understanding people differently now than unless you've lived in countries or experienced living in places as as a non-national, kind of the appreciation in different ways that gives you, and the respect for people that maybe, you only kind of get when you get to live amongst different people and sort of see yourself in a, from a different hierarchy perspective. In the Middle East is a good example, whereas, you're not sort of, in England, it's very much, you kind of, you don't really think about things like that. But whereas I think you live in the Middle East and you recognise there's a definite kind of, pecking order of kind of, from the locals to sort of the non-locals. And so it gives you a little perspective on life, I think. And then everything else that goes with it, the travel and the food and everything else. So yeah, it's great. From a business perspective, why was I an expat? So if we go back to kind of 2008, 2009, the crash. I was fortunate. I'd come out of, I'd finished any sites that I was currently working on, and we were doing stuff in the UK as well as Cyprus at the time. So I was actually developing holiday homes in Cyprus, but we'd sort of finished that era. And then I wouldn't say I certainly didn't see it coming, but as soon as it was coming, I was able to shift my position quite quickly just because I wasn't overly committed at the time. So again, very fortunate. There's definitely no kind of foresight there. It was a timing point. But what it allowed me to do was, from the monies that we held as a business, I looked at opportunistic acquisitions. So I was very much looking to buy distressed assets out of West Register, which was the toxic bank in the UK at the time. So a lot of developers had lost their stock to the banks, where they pulled the plug and put them into sort of this toxic bank, and they held them there. And West Register was the entity that ultimately sold those back out. So they would look through the bag of assets that they'd taken back from other developers or individuals, and they would assess whether they were going to keep them longer term and let them play out. So anything that was build complete, anything that was producing income, they would keep, and then they would ride it out. And I think they probably did a good job for the UK taxpayer on that basis, because not a lot of stuff was sort of fire sold. But the stuff that they couldn't find a job for, and a lot of those were half-finished developments where there might be issues in the ground or things they couldn't understand, technical issues around warranties. So a lot of that sort of stuff they didn't really have a job for, and they didn't really have the expertise to make them income producing. Yeah. So I was looking to buy those, and that's where the sort of this second generation under the Prosperity umbrella started buying those distressed assets as half-finished sites or challenging sites. I'd got a certain amount of monies myself, and then needed to raise some more. And obviously the UK wasn't the time to do that. So decided on the Middle East to start with. So I spent some time in Dubai and then Abu Dhabi, and then moved on then to KL. Yeah, and then that was my kind of, so we were out for 6 years, I think, in total. Okay. So reasonable time, enough time. I mean, it was always the plan to come back to England. I mean, I've had a business here, so I had to. The development business was growing, and I needed to be back. Yeah. So it wasn't really a case of being able to run the business remotely, but for that era of time, which was a definite lull within construction and property generally for that kind of 5 years, probably leading back to where we kind of started to come back to life around 2013, 2014. For me to be there and utilise my time, I think, to the best advantage by building networks. I was also building sales networks because as a developer, we were looking to sort of, sell our developments. But a lot of the clients we were talking to were kind of keen on the idea of owning the underlying assets, so they were interested in investing in the actual property, bricks and mortar. But because of the climate, they weren't interested in investing through any sort of fund structure. Yeah. So we kind of, that sort of changed our tact a bit, really. I think from the anticipation of what we were going to achieve going out to what we did achieve, it was probably better, but it was different. So by the time I came back, we'd got some good partners there, and and we built some really good, strong sales relationships as well. So which have continued to this day.
Cool expat story. I think things often go a different way to what you expected, but often work out for the best. Yeah. I think if you you stick with it and have a good plan in place and keep your goals going as well. I think because if you don't have, certainly within property, if you don't have any goals, then you're going to end up probably doing nothing with it.
Yeah.
And you look back in 5 years and go, oh, I wish, when was the best time to buy 5 years ago?
Yeah.
Or yesterday, or whatever it may be. But Joe, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're
It's
welcome.
been a fun conversation, got to say.
Thank you.